We hear a lot about change today. What are the key attributes for successful change?
That's an interesting question. It's a big question, and I would start my answer, I think, almost with a negative or indeed a challenge. The research tells us that about 70% or over 70% of change initiatives fail. And by fail, we mean they fail to recoup or achieve the objectives for which they were originally devised. So the dice is loaded against us in this absolutely fascinating world of change. Now, just with that gauntlet placed well and truly centre stage, we just have to think the market and competitive pressures in most organisations, irrespective of sector, have been considerable, and I think will continue to be considerable. Therefore, organisations have had no choice but to revise their strategic model and indeed their execution model. So they've got to look at what businesses they're in, whether they exit those businesses, or which businesses they could accelerate growth. But strategically, they have to really dig down and just think really where the opportunities are and maybe where they need to withdraw. Costs therefore need to be realigned, or costs and resources need to be realigned. And some of this may be a complete change to model, such as IT initiatives, such as even outsourcing. So there's lots and lots of alternatives to be considered, even just to be in the same business as they were in last year. So you end up with a configuration of a business that's simply very different. Now, what tends to happen is normally the board and the senior managers have been heavily involved at various times in deep debate and thought about these changes. And then finally one day they decide, or the CEO decides, to unleash their thinking to the rest of the organisation. Now, in developing all this thinking, they have prepared themselves intellectually and indeed emotionally about the change, about the need for change, and gaining some excitement about New World, which still doesn't exist yet. The organisation have been kept away from all of that. So when they announce these changes, it can be quite difficult. Not everybody is going to stand up and applaud when the balloons come down or the bands play, although the chief executives would love that to happen. Change is something that senior people in Western organisations do to junior people. And a lot of people think that change is bad, because change is a euphemism for cost reduction. And cost reduction is a euphemism for heads being severed and people being made redundant and losing jobs. So they know when the music stops, there's going to be less chairs to sit on. And it doesn't have to be like that. So we have to get people excited about the change. We have to get them excited intellectually about the change. They have to describe their vision for the future. That's an exciting vision. And it's compelling. No matter who you are sat in the room, irrespective of your role, you can see the sense in what they're saying. The bit that gets missed so often, and this is actually to do with whether it's going to be successful or not, a lot of people don't see what is wrong with the current model. Now that's a big deal. And organisations are so excited about the new model, they forget about explaining that the existing model, although maybe on a day-to-day basis it's relatively successful, it's maybe not sustainable. And therefore they have to work really hard at getting that message across. So the message is, if we stay as we are, doing what we're doing in the same way in which we're doing it, in the businesses in which we're doing it, we are going to die. We're going to get beaten by the competitors. So that's a big message that needs to get across. Another point is, change needs to get well into the organisation. People at all levels have to own it. And one of the failures that I see is that we can't get the leadership for change moved outside the boardroom. People just see it as something they do when they've got another hour in the day, or we have to go to a meeting to do with this change or transition. It becomes a separate part, and it needs to be ingrained into the business. Some businesses struggle with the capacity for change, because as much as they're trying to run the existing railway, which is taking all the hours that God makes, where do we find this time to invent the new railway? And at some point, you're running the existing railway and you're sort of half running a new railway. So you're in that twilight zone, and that's the dangerous zone. We need to actually look at the existing railway and cut off the pieces that we really are going to leave behind early and clearly. And those need to be done so that we're creating capacity for change, so that we can therefore start loading in new things. It's not a flick of a switch. It's not like ordering from Microsoft Change 2.0 and sticking it on the server. It doesn't work like that. So we can overload a business very quickly, and that's when heads go down, because the pressures and tension are huge. And that brings me to, I think, a crucial point. Change has to be led. Change just doesn't happen. It's not a series of processes. It's not just a great big plan or Gantt chart ticking boxes when we do various things. Although there is some of that, there has to be some discipline in the way in which we change the business. But it requires leadership, it requires inspiration, it requires communication at all levels. It's not just one great big presentation in a huge conference room with dry ice and lasers, and the chief executive standing there saying what he or she thinks about the world in the future. It's much more than that, and it's an ongoing day-by-day process, and the plans for change have to change themselves. Too many people are rigorous in that's the plan and we must stick to it. Well, in the army, I certainly know that no plan ever survives the first contact with the enemy. Plans have to be constantly revised because circumstances change. And equally, not every part of the change process is going to be wildly successful. Some things will fail, and we have to learn from the failure, change the plan, go back in, do it a different way. So it constantly requires that inspirational, authentic leadership. And we have to measure things, the things that matter, not tons and tons of things that don't matter. There are half a dozen crucial things. Some of them are financial, some of them are maybe to do with morale, motivation, competitive positioning, product, innovation, all of those things. We have to measure those things that matter. And just because the board have announced this plan and they're starting to see some success, be very careful about popping the champagne corks and declaring a victory. Victory is only when you take and occupy a new position in army terms, and it's the same in business. When you take and occupy the new model and the new model is entrenched and it's working, that's when you can start to declare victory. And my final point is that you cannot get effective change, or let's put it this way, it's unlikely you will get effective change and be part of the 30% that work without addressing your reward and remuneration strategies. Too many of these are based on individual performance, and for this to work, it's going to require a complete redrafting of the remuneration strategies so that alignment is rewarded, non-alignment won't work, teams are rewarded. So we have to look at objectives and performance measures in a much wider and more circumspect way than we've ever looked at them in the past. But the challenge is there, for change programs, 70% fail. So you need to understand the bits that live in the 70% and what makes the 30%. How can we get from the 70% to the 30% with some level of certainty?